Britain had captured Philadelphia. So why did it send 1,200 Hessians to attack one small fort? Because Britain controlled the city, but it didn't control the river that supplied it. And on the New Jersey shore of the Delaware stood Fort Mercer. Inside were only about 500 American defenders. They couldn't defeat 1,200 Hessians in the open. So their commander, Christopher Greene, decided not to fight them in the open. He would make the fort fight for him. And when the Hessians finally attacked, they walked straight into the battle Greene had prepared. In September 1777, British forces defeated Washington at Brandywine. Then, on September 26th, British troops entered Philadelphia. The American capital was theirs, but an army occupying Philadelphia still needed food, ammunition, reinforcements, and communications. And the Delaware River was the natural route connecting the city to the sea. The Americans were blocking that route with two forts, Fort Mifflin on an island in the river, and Fort Mercer on the New Jersey shore. American naval forces and river obstructions strengthened the defenses. So Britain had captured Philadelphia, but it had not yet secured the system that could sustain its army there. Fort Mercer was one of the obstacles, and Britain decided to remove it. Christopher Greene commanded the fort. His force was far smaller than the army coming for him. Modern battlefield estimates put the American garrison at roughly 500 men, while contemporary American reports describe the Hessian attacking force as about 1,200. Greene could not win by matching their numbers, so he changed the equation. Instead of meeting the Hessians outside the fort, he strengthened the defenses and prepared the approaches. But here's the important part. Greene didn't need to stop the Hessians from reaching the fort. He needed to make reaching it as difficult as possible. An abatis of sharpened timber blocked the approaches. A ditch and palisades created additional obstacles, and the defenders positioned their weapons to fire on men trying to cross them. The fort was no longer just a place to hide. It was becoming a machine for slowing an attacking army. And then, the Hessians arrived. On October 21st, Hessian troops under Carl von Donop crossed into New Jersey. The next day they marched toward Red Bank. By midday, they were within sight of Fort Mercer. Donop demanded the fort surrender. Greene refused. So the Hessians formed their attacking columns and began the advance. Across roughly 400 yards of open ground, the Americans opened fire. The Hessians kept coming. They crossed the open ground and reached the first obstacle, the abatis. Now the attack slowed. The Hessians hacked through the sharpened timber. They crossed the ditch. Some reached sections of the palisades. And for a moment, the fort was in real danger, because the Hessians had actually reached the defenses, but they had not solved the problem behind them. The Hessians needed to break through, but some of the tools required to clear the remaining obstacles had not been brought with them. They were now packed into exposed positions in front of the fort. They couldn't advance quickly. They couldn't use all 1,200 men at once, and they couldn't easily get away without exposing themselves again. Then the Americans opened fire. The fort's artillery and infantry hit the attackers, and American vessels on the Delaware added supporting fire from the river. The Hessians tried to push forward. They couldn't. They tried to break through. They couldn't. The assault was turning into a trap. Then a Hessian officer was shot, and Donop himself was hit. The commander who had come to take the fort was now being carried away from it. The Hessians finally withdrew. The entire assault had lasted roughly 40 minutes. Fort Mercer was still American. Washington's reports estimated that the Hessians had suffered roughly 400 to 500 killed and wounded, while American losses were only around 30 to 40. Exact totals vary between contemporary reports and modern reconstructions, but the scale of the result is not in serious doubt. A much smaller American garrison had stopped the assault and inflicted devastating losses on the attackers, and Donop's wound was mortal. 3 days later, he died. But here's the part that matters. Britain still hadn't solved the problem. Philadelphia was occupied. The Delaware was still contested. And Fort Mercer was still there. Red Bank did not permanently stop the British from opening the Delaware. The British continued their campaign. Fort Mifflin eventually fell after a prolonged bombardment. Fort Mercer was later abandoned, and the British ultimately secured the river. So this wasn't the battle that saved Philadelphia. It wasn't the battle that won the Revolution. Its importance was more precise. It exposed the difference between capturing a city and controlling everything that keeps an army in that city. The British had taken Philadelphia, but they still needed the river. To secure the river, they needed the forts. And every fort meant another operation, another expenditure of men and ammunition, another delay. At Red Bank, one of those operations ended in disaster. Now we can finally answer the question from the beginning. How did roughly 500 Americans hold off 1,200 Hessians? They didn't fight 1,200 men at once. They controlled where those men could fight. The Hessians had numbers. Greene had prepared ground. They had momentum. He had obstacles. They had open ground to cross. He had artillery waiting. And once the Hessians reached the fort, their numerical advantage became much harder to use. The fort compressed their attack. The obstacles slowed them. The defenders concentrated their fire. And the river added another direction of attack. Greene had turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. That's what makes Red Bank more than a story about a small American force defeating a larger one. It's a lesson in how armies actually fight. Having more soldiers doesn't automatically mean having more usable combat power. Those soldiers need space. They need movement. They need coordination. And they need a way through the enemy's defenses. At Fort Mercer, the Americans took those advantages away. The Hessians brought 1,200 men, but the fort decided how many of them could actually fight at any one moment. And that changed everything. One fort didn't defeat 1,200 Hessians in an open battle. It did something smarter. It made 1,200 men fight a battle they couldn't win. Britain had captured Philadelphia. But on October 22, 1777, one small fort on the Delaware showed the British just how difficult it was to turn that victory into secure control. Because Britain had the army, Greene had the battlefield. And for 40 minutes at Red Bank, the battlefield was stronger.